You have a page and you want to display some data. How do you actually do that while you're using SvelteKit? That's what we're going to see now. In the previous video, we built up some routes using SvelteKit. Now what we're going to do is actually feed those routes with real data. I was just using a static array in the past, but the essence here remained the same. I made some adjustments to this app if you saw the previous video. If not, I recommend checking that one out. We're going to load the trips here on the left, and we're going to see the details of the trip inside of this main section here. And that's all we need to do for this. In the code, what I did change here is that in the lib folder now we have this server with a database here. I am using Drizzle here, and I have a SQLite database that is not really relevant. It's just I'm just explaining what's going on behind the scenes here. But as far as SvelteKit concerns, it doesn't change anything. What it does do is it simulates now what the code will be in a real production code, right? We don't normally store data in fixed arrays, but rather in databases. So this is what we're going to do. It's a simple application, but it's going to be enough for us to load some data, to interact with URL interfaces, to look at some performance tricks, and even have a bonus performance at the end of this. Stay tuned for that. So let's start with the basics. In the /trips route here, I want to load all the trips in the left, and we're gonna do this through this layout.server.ts file. Why the layout? Because in this layout.svelte, I'm getting that data and I'm iterating over it to display in the page. So you're seeing some errors here. That's because we're not still returning any data. In the layout.svelte file, all I'm doing is looking at the trips that is coming from the data and will be coming from the data, I rather should say, iterating over it and displaying some links to navigate between the trips. At the bottom here, I have just the main header for the navigation, this navigation here, and that's pretty much it. Now, in order to return any data for the page or this layout.svelte component here, we need to export a load function here, and whatever gets returned is made available to the components props here. So we're retrieving data, and data here now matches a trips that is a never array because I'm just returning an array here. Let's actually implement returning some data here. So what I'm doing is I'm getting all the trips, and I'm using Drizzle with this function here to get all the trips in my database and returning the trips. Because I define the types with Drizzle, I have types for trips here. Whatever is returned from load here is what is passed to the props. And automatically we know that we now have a trips and it's of type ID string and destination string. Just by doing that, I have now my trips. If I reload here, we can see all the trips on this side. A couple of things that I want to reiterate is that the types for data here are auto-generated by SvelteKit. I don't have to do anything for it. It just generates as soon as I return a value from the load function here. And again, whatever is returned in here, so if I add anything else in here, let's say a test, which is going to be a string, I automatically can access data.test in here, right? Now, if we continue here and I try to navigate to one of those trips, we're going to see an error here, something wrong. And that happens because within that route, the page.server.ts loader here is just returning a not found because I haven't implemented this yet. But in essence, this works exactly the same way. I'm exporting a load function here. In this case, I'm just returning an error, but I need to return, I can now return the data. So if I just do that now, what I'm doing here is I'm getting the params for this load function, extracting the ID, which should match this here in my database. And then I'm getting that trip from the database based on the ID, and I'm getting entries. As I said, this is a trip journal app, and I have entries for the journal, and I'm returning both the entries and the trip as part of the data from the load function. In the page.svelte, this is a bunch of markup and it's a bunch of Svelte code. I'm not gonna go over this and explain what this is doing. The focus here is just how load functions work. But I'm just getting the data, again, from the props, doing some manipulation out of this, and displaying the data in here. So I have a session here to display the title, Down here, we do have a section for the entries. This is the entry, the title of the entry, sorry. I have a section here for the destination. Then we have an iteration for the entries here. And we can see this in the page here now. So this is the destination here. If I click on another one, it gets another one. And I'm just loading all the entries in here. And I also did a navigation down to the bottom here, to the previous and next, and so on. So nothing really different between page.server.ts with the load function here and layout.server.ts. It's the exact same thing, but one is serving data to the layout file and the other one is serving data to the page file. But there's one important notion here, and is that all load functions, they run in parallel for the same route. What does that mean? It means that this load function here and this load function here run at the same time when we execute this route here. One doesn't need to wait for the other just because a page is a nested route within this layout file here. We can definitely verify this and quickly by adding a delay here. So let's say I'm going to wait for this to complete after 500 milliseconds, let's say. And in the load function for the layout, we're gonna wait for, I don't know, let's say 1000 milliseconds. Now I'm gonna switch back here and open the network tab. And what we're gonna see is that this page is going to take about 1000 milliseconds to run. And you can see this right here. So even though we are waiting for 1000 milliseconds here and 500 milliseconds in here, we're not waiting for 1500 milliseconds. We're just waiting for about 1000. That's because both of them are executed at the same time. You could, in theory, depend on the parent. So let's say I am depending on the parent to execute. I'm gonna await parent. Let's say there is some data that the parent returns that I need in this case, right? Right now we're just returning these two things here. And let's say I really depend on test to display in this page. Now, what's happening is we're definitely going to have to wait for 1500 milliseconds here. So around that, right? A little bit more. But that's because they're now executing in sequence and not in parallel because I define that there's a dependency on the parent data being returned. Here's the important tip on this here. If you can avoid waiting on the parents, you're going to have a more performant page. If the data can be passed down to the page via its params, then you don't need to wait for the parent to execute and then retrieve whatever data you need to finish loading the data for the page. That's very important. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but if you can avoid that, that's better. Let me revert this here quickly. So I'm going to remove this one. We don't need this delay, and we also don't need this delay here, and we don't need the test, right? The next piece of performance tip that I want to give you is you can stream data to the page and to the component page, right? So take this example here. I'm gonna import get photos from here, and if we look at get photos, I also am delaying it for 2000 milliseconds. So it's a synthetically slower function to call. If I come here and I get, let's do this. Let's go and get photos here, actually, and then return the photos. Okay. So what's happening here is that this page is going to take about 2 seconds to load. Yep. And we had to wait for the full 2 seconds in order to show anything related to that page. So if I click here on Lisbon, for instance, we're going to see that this is going to also take about 2 seconds. And then we saw Lisbon change here. Let me click on Kyoto for a second. And there you go. Obviously, this is not good. And one thing that we can do is stream the data that is low later after the page has loaded. So let's try and do this. Instead of awaiting this here, okay, I'm gonna move this all the way to the top, and I'll explain why in a second. And in the page here, just let me see, just beneath the title section, I'm going to display the photos. And now you can see photos here, right? Let me reload this page so you can see this. So we see the title, we can see the entries being loaded and displayed. We just see the photos being displayed a couple of seconds after. So you see the entries down here, and then we load. I'm going to reload here so we can see this again. So loading the photos, entries are there, the title is there, and when the photos come back, we display them. If I navigate to a different trip here, the same thing happens. We saw the title change quickly here, and the entries changes as well. And when the photos are ready, we load that. Let me show a couple of things here that's important. First, we're leveraging Svelte await here. So await can await on a promise. So we know that this is a promise for photos here. So it waits for this to be available. When it is, we display the photos in here, right? And while it's not available, what we do is we display some indication that the data is being loaded. On the load side, one thing that is very important. So when I wrote this function here, I moved this to the top, okay? And then I am waiting for these two other functions to execute. And this is important because this line here triggers before we execute these two. If this was at the bottom here, this would only trigger after these two lines had been completed executing because of the await here. We don't notice this very much in our page right now because it is returning very quickly the trip and the entries here. But let's again synthetically add some time to this and await a delay of 500 milliseconds here. What's going to happen now is that when I load this page and I look at the network tab, this is going to be 2500 milliseconds to fully load the page here, right? Why? Because we had to wait for this 500 milliseconds for getting the trip, and only after that we triggered loading. Let me go back to the correct file here. Only after that we triggered loading the get photos. That takes 2 seconds, right? So let me move this to the top, and by doing that, I don't wait for anything else to load before I start loading this. All right, let's move on with another part of getting data here. When I'm loading the entries, there are several here, and one thing I could do to improve this is to have some pagination. And if I look at the get entries function, it does support pagination. Again, I'm not going to go over the details here, and probably there is some not handled edge cases, but the fact is they support pagination. But we're not making use of that yet. So let me change that a little bit. I had this, and in my snippet here, I don't have the photos anymore. So let me add the photos one more time. Okay, this is fixed. It's returning the photos. And if I reload this page here, we can see, oh, I still need to change to add the markup. So let me do that. And it's in this one. And you now see that I have some errors because I need to update my script portion here to actually get the pagination stuff. Let's do that. And if I now load this page, you can see that I have the pagination here. I can click next to the next page. I can move between pages, and it's updating the query param here to the number of the page. How this is working? Let's go back to the page.server.ts. I'm looking at the URL now, and I'm extracting the page number and making sure that this is a number. That's simply it. And now I'm passing the current page to the get entries. That's it. And for the purposes of this video, what I'm trying to explain here is that when loading data, we have access to the URL params here, and we can leverage that to get the data that we need. And it's important to understand here, I'm going to add a console.log to say that the page load running. And if you look at the logs here in the server, I'm going to reload the page one more time. We can see this being called here. And if I come down here and I navigate to a different page, you see that this is loading again, right? So this is logging again, I should say, rather. Point being is just by changing the URL search param, this function here is being called again and serving the data one more time. One important distinction to make is that the load function for the page is running again whenever either of these arguments change, be the page ID, right, the trip ID, or the page number. If we look at the layout.server.ts and we also add a console.log here for the layout load running, let's take a look at what's going to happen here. I'm going to first reload this page here. Let me remove the page just for a second, and we can see that first we had the layout load running, then the page layout running. I'm gonna switch to a different page, to a different trip. Only the page load was executed. Why? Because the arguments here, or the params, I should say, for this route only affected the trip page, not the trips route, only the trip route. So the trips route here on this folder here for this page and this layout, that was not affected by switching between different trips. And that means that in my console log here, I only see the page load running, not the layout running. It didn't need to run again. The load function didn't have any dependencies on what changed in the route, and that's a very important distinction. The same thing will happen if I navigate to a different page here. We're gonna see that this increased by 1 again, and let me just move this here so you can see better. Only the trip details page changed when I navigated to a different page. And you can also see that I don't actually need to navigate. This is a pattern of the router in SvelteKit. By default, just by overing a different route, it prefetches the data. So that's why you're seeing the page load running here. But the point is, we don't need to reload the trips data, only the trip details. Another cool pattern of SvelteKit is that the load function is smart enough to only run again if we change something that it depends on. So for instance, we know it depends on a param from page, but if I change any other param because it doesn't depend, this is not going to reload. So let me stop here so that we can clear the logs for a second. And I'm going to come here to this page, and at the bottom here, let me just add a button sort. And what this button sort is doing is, let me import the dependencies here quickly. This button sort here is just simulating adding a search param to the URL that we don't depend on. It's just adding sort to the URL. And you're gonna see that being executed here in a second. So we see here that we loaded the page, the layout, the page. Now on my page here, I have this sort button, and what it's emulating, let's suppose that this is going to change how the entries are being sorted. It's not going to do anything. All it's going to do is add a search param to the URL here. If I click on it, you see changing, but the page never reloaded again. And that's because the page server here does not depend on this sort param. If it did, it would rerun again, but because it doesn't rerun. So let me show this by just clicking on next here, and you see that we have another run of that. That's because only the page changes. One more time, if I now click on sort here, I added another argument here, and the load function didn't rerun. So that's another cool feature of SvelteKit, and something that is very important. If your page load does not need a lot of dependencies, make sure that they are not part of the body of the load function, so that you avoid rerunning this function several times when it doesn't need. Now, I know that I mentioned in the beginning another performance tip, and this is not related to SvelteKit at all. So in this case here, we have two awaits, right? One for the trip and another one for the entries. If I don't need to wait for one to then start executing the other, we can always get both. So in this case here, what I am doing is instead of waiting for one and then awaiting for the other, I'm awaiting for both at the same time here. And as a result, the page in itself doesn't change much. Is that I don't need to wait for one, then wait for the other. That's very basic, but one important distinction that many people miss. And this is very important in these days where we pay for compute services on the cloud, right? Every single time that you are awaiting, you are blocking execution and you're taking more time to compute. So if you're only blocking once instead of blocking twice, you are saving time, small time in this case, but it could be longer depending on your queries, right? But that's the tip that I have for you here. As much as you can, try to run queries in parallel. And even if you can, try to execute a single query by using inner joins or joins with SQL, right? And in this sense, you're going to avoid blocking the page as much as possible. So this is the core and the basics of how SvelteKit loads data. And I hope you were able to take something out of this. In the next video, I'm going to talk about server actions and how we can change data. Stay tuned for that. And if you missed the previous video on how routing works in SvelteKit, make sure to check that one out. In the meantime, thanks very much. See you next time.